When a bowl of hot gumbo lands on your face in front of 200 people, you learn very quickly who you are. The heat bites first, spicy peel of pepper, thick broth clinging to skin. Then the sound, that surprised, awful hush that follows an impossible thing. My napkin was slick, my pearls were sticky, and my son, my Orion, stood with his hands in his pockets and said, plain as brass, "She's right, Mama." Those words have lived in my ear like a stone ever since. They were small, they were simple, they fit in the space of a single breath, but they built a wall between us quicker than anything I'd ever done. I remember the taste of the gumbo on my lip, the way the chandelier light caught on the grease, and how even in the middle of that roar of mortification, my hands moved like they always had, finding the hem of my navy dress, touching the seam as if to check the stitches, as if that would steady me. My name is Zenobia Washington. I sew, I mend, I keep things together for a living, the seams and the names, and sometimes, when people come in with their ruffled edges, a little of their dignity. My singer sits by the window of my shop on Sylvan Street. It has a rhythm that sounds like my heartbeat when I'm steady. Thrum, thrum, the needle down, the needle up. I have a stoneware mug that's chipped on the rim. I drink my coffee from it every morning, even when all I can afford is the cheap kind. Small things anchor you when everything else is moving. I raised Orion by myself. He was the kind of boy who would peel off a corner of a comic strip and use it as a plane for his toy soldiers. He followed the rhythm of my hands on the singer. He loved the smell of fresh fabric. He hated to see me tired. There were late nights when his supper was whatever was quickest to heat, and early mornings when I pressed his collars with the iron and told him always that whatever else the world gave him, he must never give up his honesty. That was the sermon of my life, honesty and work, the kind of dignity you stitch into yourself out of necessity. When he got older and started talking about work prospects downtown, I sewed him a navy jacket and made him promise to wear it to job interviews. He wore that jacket the night he got the internship that turned into a job. He called me from the parking lot, and I heard the city in his voice, so full of promise, and I bent over my singer like a woman remembering a prayer. Then came Clementina. She was soft and bright and very young, all satin and laughter, like a song you couldn't help but listen to. She wore her hair long and careful. She smelled of citrus and gardens. I met her once at a summer picnic, her hands cool and quick when she took a hem in the dark so it would sit right at the seamstress table. She had an easy grace that made me think of the girls in old films, the kind that sheltered a hard life with a smile. And then there was Seraphina. Miss Seraphina Vance, as she liked to be called in a room where names were displayed like jewels. She came from Buckhead, every inch of her lined up with privilege, from the way she stacked her jewelry to the way she arranged her salads at luncheon. She wore pearls like crowns. Her words were small and precise. They arrived delivered from coolness. She could put a criticism inside a compliment and wrap it in a ribbon so neat it felt like flattery. She had a husband who retreated into his drink, a steady man named Reginald, who smiled like a man looking for a map to forget. At first, they were worlds apart from the little shop on Sylvan Street. Their invitations came in thick cream envelopes. Mine came with a polite note and a pale card. Miss Zenobia, it read, like a distance. The first time Seraphina called to include me in a gathering, it felt like a favor. The second time, the favor held a message. You don't belong here. She wrote me a suggestion about pearls, what matched navy and what didn't. She complimented the way I kept things humble in front of my son. Someone laughed politely. I smiled because I've built a life on sewing small kindnesses into the hems of bigger, sharper things. There were small exclusions. The first one was a teacup at a bridal shower that arrived at my shop on a Tuesday afternoon, a delicate thing in a box with tissue paper, and a note, "For your collection." Miss Seraphina meant it as civility, but the music underneath the note was a lesson in distance. Invitations stopped being personal. They arrived as formalities. I was never asked where to sit at lunch. I was not sent a fitting appointment for dress alterations. They told me someone else would take care of those details. The words were polite. The edges were not. You get used to being left outside in different ways. You get used to hearing your name said like an afterthought. You swallow a small humiliation, remind yourself that you have a singer that will never be a stranger, and you keep breathing. Then the envelope came. It was a manila thing, heavy in my mailbox, the flap sealed like a mouth. There was no return address. Inside were photographs, edges curled the way photographs do that had been handled.
They showed Orion and Serafina at different hotels in different cities. Nothing explicit. Cropped shoulders, the backs of heads, hands close together on a table, a lipstick mark on a napkin. There were hotel receipts folded in, a line where a room had been charged, dates snaking over a year and a half. There was a photograph that had been taken through partially closed blinds, 2 silhouettes leaning in, the light caught wrong, and on the back in pencil, 3 words: "She'll take it all." When the envelope sat in my lap, I felt the old singer thrum of my heart go out of rhythm. I thought of those days when he was small, how I had ironed a jacket till the cloth shone, how I had taught him to cycle, how I had watched him stand tall in his diploma.
I thought of Clementina's laugh sliding through a room and wondered who had the right to take that from her. Then I thought of Serafina's pearls and the way she had arranged my life like a fabric she would trim. I did not know what to do with the envelope. There are decisions that break things in half and choices that can hold them together. You learn, as a woman who has sewn a life from nothing, to weigh them both. I called Booker Hughes. Booker is a small man with a voice like a gravel road. He wears sensible shoes and has eyes that look at things without blinking. He runs a private investigator firm out of a strip of offices above a barber shop. He smells faintly of coffee and old paper, and he treats proof like a reliable meal, necessary, plain, and not to be mistaken with fancy. He came by the shop the next afternoon. He sat on the wooden chair by my counter and watched my singer do the work of hemming a prom dress, quick, efficient, a pocket of motion. I poured him coffee from the chipped stoneware, and he wrapped his hands around the mug like a man who understands warmth. "We can verify everything in here," he said after I slid the envelope across the table. He did not say it with triumph. He said it with cataloging. Hotel records, timestamps, matching names. Bank transfers can be traced. If there's a recording you mention, his voice lowered slightly, respectful of the shape of the thing, we can authenticate it. He named the files in a way my mind could place like buttons on a coat. Hotel ledger, bank transfer, audio clip. He spoke of legal processes in the plain tone of someone who knows how fragile lives are when proof gets loose. He also spoke of consequences. There is a line between evidence and a life that fractures under the weight of truth. He knew I knew it. That night, I sat on the stoop behind my shop with my stoneware mug cooling in my hands and thought about consequences until the words were a chorus. Call the police, and you might send your boy to prison. Do nothing, and someone else, someone young and trusting, would be left with a life rearranged by betrayal. Take the evidence to a family elder with means, and perhaps you can protect Clementina quietly, keep it from becoming a public catastrophe. Or you could be the one to break the story loose and watch the world that raised Serafina crack open in front of your son. I thought of Cornelius Estrada then. The name arrived like a bell. Cornelius is what his name announces. Old money, older manners. He's Clementina's grandfather, a man who runs a trust and means something when he speaks of affairs like this. He keeps a certain kind of order. I had met him once, through a sewing job he commissioned for his housekeeper's granddaughter. He had a way of looking at worn fabric and seeing value where others saw only thread. I did not know if Cornelius would believe me. I did not know if he would move. I only knew he had the power to make certain changes, freeze a trust, call an attorney, ask for records. He was not a policeman. He was someone who could act where laws and family lines tangled. Over the next days, Booker fed me the steady, cold facts. There were transfers, small ones that became larger. The money moved from Serafina's account into accounts whose names matched shell companies that listed addresses in luxury districts. There were hotel bookings under Serafina's name with dates that overlapped with trips Orion had not told me about. Booker gave me copies of phone logs, faded and neat. He played a clipped, muffled recording for me in his car. Serafina's voice, low, coaxing. Orion's, unsure. Talk of rearranging things for the good of the family. Talk of timing when certain people would be away. I listened in the dark of his sedan, the engine still warm, the recording like a small, dishonorable light in a closed room. It wasn't salacious, it was leverage. It was a plan being made like a pattern, seams traced out for someone else to fill. I sat with that knowledge and felt every stitch I'd ever sewn tremble. "Do you want to press charges?" Booker asked finally. There was a list of things I could do that would be lawful and blunt. I could take the evidence to the police. I could bring it to a lawyer. I could go public.
Each of those choices had a cost. Any of them could hurt Orion in ways that might not be repairable. He was my son. He was also a man who had been moved and shaped by another's hand. I thought about Clementina again, about her easy laugh and the way she trusted without counting the cost. I wanted to protect her from being the one who'd lose her family's trust to a slow, deliberate plan. I wanted to prevent the theft, not simply to punish the thief. I don't want to ruin him, I said to Booker, but I can't let her get everything either. I can't let an innocent girl lose what she doesn't even know she has. Booker leaned back. There are people with authority who can act faster than the police, who can put controls on a trust, who can send a firm letter and make banks pause transactions until records are sorted. If you want this kept out of the papers while we sort things, that's possible. We made a plan that was neither dramatic nor clean. Verify every piece, collect the chain. Booker moved quietly, calls to clerks, quietly ordered copies of records, a polite request to a hotel manager about room charges. He told me what he found, as if speaking about weather. Here are the dates. Here are the ledgers. Here's who signed. He did not judge. He reported. Meanwhile, life at the shop hummed on. People kept coming to have hems fixed or buttons replaced. The singer kept its steady tick. I measured cloth and measured time, and in between I stitched up wounds that were not mine to own, and I tended my boy's childhood trinkets like a museum patron protecting relics. I found small comforts in routine.
I poured coffee into the chipped stoneware mug every morning and watched the steam fog the window. There were moments when Orion would call, and I would hear the city background in his voice, the whooshing of someone moving fast, and he'd ask about simple things. Did I still have the blue thread? How were the curtains coming? Seeking small pieces of the life he had left behind when he'd moved up. I would answer, and then fold the call away like a letter. There were times I caught him looking past me, as if trying to measure whether I was part of his landscape now, or only a memory. Clementina's wedding invitations came like a soft breeze. They were heavy and embossed. They smelled faintly of lemon. They arrived addressed to Miss Zenobia Washington. I held mine in my hands and felt the weight of nearly every choice I had made. I knew she'd expect her grandmother at every table. I knew Serafina would orchestrate the seating like a conductor. I knew there would be cameras and guests who kept their phones ready. Booker called one evening with a discovery. He had matched a set of transfers, small monthly sums that suddenly increased in the months before the engagement, to a shell company that paid a firm that had been hired for consultations. There was a record of a scheduled payment the week of the wedding. He said, "It's like watching a seamstress stitch while someone else tightens the fabric. They're shaping the pattern." "How much time do I have?" I asked him. "Enough to be careful," he said. "Not enough to be sloppy." I could have stayed away from the wedding. I could have refused the invitation, written a note, stayed in my shop and let them finish whatever they were making. Pride could have told me to stay away and fold the hurt inside until it hardened. But there are some things you watch happen if you're a mother, some scenes you can't not be present for. Being there is not always about confrontation. Sometimes it's about witness. When the day came, I dressed in navy. I chose a dress that fit like a sober truth, not flashy, the kind of navy that suited my shoulders and did not cry for attention. I put on the pearls Clementina's mother had once complimented at a small event, pearls that had been passed down in my family, a single strand I had kept from my mother. They were not the kind Serafina wore, but they were mine, threaded with decades of life. I packed the envelope, the photograph evidence, into the lining of my purse, folded under the ticket and the receipt that Booker had given me. I slipped my singer-thrust fingers into gloves for a moment just to feel that old steadiness. There is a particular light in places like the St. Regis Ballroom. It hangs with an empire of chandeliers, and it makes everything look like a story you might have seen in a magazine. White roses, linen, the hush of polished silver. The air smelled of perfume, roses, and the soft burn of candles. Men stood with stiff shoulders in tuxedos. Women had practiced their smiles. The staircases were marble. The reception hall had gilded panels that caught your flash like teeth. You can tell a certain way of living by how it lays out a room. When I walked in, I felt the attention move like a tide. Eyes perhaps wondered who this woman was who had arrived alone, with her posture even and her dress careful. I felt the small, clinical observation of the room, as if someone were taking my measure. I sat where my invitation specified, a small table near the back, far from the main family cluster. A waitress poured water into my glass with the quiet of someone who had poured for many such nights. There were toasts before the meal. People laughed, and for a while the world was what it was supposed to be. Vows earlier, champagne, a band tuning like a hive preparing to hum. And then the first edge appeared, a whispered exchange between two women who had led my day's exclusions, a glance across a room. The sort of small handling of social knives Serafina favored. She moved through the room like breath moved through lace, quiet and exact. When she smiled at me, it felt like a scheduled acknowledgement rather than warmth. She had a way of making civility into exile. I held my stoneware mug in my thoughts, not in my hand. I remembered the way my hands had mended shirts that belonged to people who never knew how they were held together. I drank water in small sips and watched the band begin to play the first notes of a slow song. The dinner was a 5-course arrangement meant to confuse hunger with elegance. Oysters like small moons, then a salad that tasted of something you might recognize from a garden you'd never walk, then the main, hot gumbo served in shallow bowls, steam rising like a small lost prayer. The restaurant manager moved through the room in the precise steps of a trained man whose job it is to make ceremony look casual. When the bowls came, they were steaming, heavy with the smells of bay leaf and tomatoes, and something darker, cayenne perhaps, and when the waiter set the bowl in front of me, the air seemed to press in a little. I had eaten gumbo 1,000 times. My own recipe, the one that could warm a cold night, was thicker and kinder. This one had a sharp look in its steam. The band played soft. Hands moved with forks. People talked of stationery and florists. A woman laughed loudly at a memory of the bride as a child. Then Serafina stood up with the little kind of movement that announces a thing already decided. She was at the head table, and she came toward me, living out the script she'd set for the evening, civility with the teeth filed down to a whisper. Her eyes were cool, and there was an audience in her manner. Someone near her lifted a glass like a chorus. She took one of those measured steps, and I could see the chisel of performance shape her face. She raised her hand. She spoke, and her voice was smooth.
People leaned in to hear whatever elegantly brutal thing she wished to say. I felt my breath narrow, as if I were watching someone unfold a knife, not to use it, but to show the room that it existed. The insult itself was a question of phrasing, a public diminution wrapped in terms of propriety, about knowing your place, about appropriate presentation, about assumptions that had been made by people who had never changed a thread in their life for anyone but themselves. It was a dismissal when the world had been waiting for a benediction. When she poured the bowl of gumbo, she did it with the slow, deliberate finality of someone who wanted an image. It was like watching a portrait painted in humiliation. Steam hit the air. The bowl found my lap and then my chest, the hot soup parting like a tide to my collar. The napkin in my hand went slick. The pearls were sticky. The room took that breath away. The band stuttered. Laughter paused at the lip. I remember how it felt to have hot gumbo settle into the crease of my skin. The sting, the smell, the way the room's hush pressed against my ears. I remember Orion's face in that exact second. Clean, eyes turned away from me, toward the woman who'd thrown her servitude like a gauntlet. He did not move to protect me. He stood grounded, a cord between two worlds, and said simply, "She's right, Mama." It was a sentence that did what all unkind sentences can do. It made everything narrow. In that small space, I could hear the singer inside me, slow as a closed door. I could have stood and made a scene. I could have slapped a hand from a woman who had no right to behave like that, or climbed over tables, or unfolded every secret like laundry. I had been offered all the dramatic possibilities. Instead, I breathed. My hands found the hem of my navy dress as if to recompose the seam. I wiped at my face with the napkin in a motion that was both practical and ceremonial. Not a surrender, but an act of private holding. People were standing now, some in shock, some in the little staccato of the gossip-hungry. My pearls hung heavy, catching the light, sticky and intact. I felt a coolness in the place where my heart had been storming. It was not the calm of weakness. It was a steadying, like the singer's thrum finding its tempo after a jam. I rose slowly.
Not wildly, not theatrically. I did not shout. I felt all the choices in me like threats waiting to be picked. I left the table before anyone could decide how to place me in the story they preferred. I walked past linen and silver, the chandeliers making a net of light over my head. My dress bore a smear like a watermark where the gumbo had rested. I passed by the shell of faces, some with pity, some with hunger. My purse was at my elbow. My hand was in my pocket like a seamstress touch that is more habit than plan. No one had to raise a hand to stop me. No one had to do anything at all. Outside, the air felt like someone had opened a window in a heated room.
It was cool and merciful. I sat down on the steps by the side entrance, the ones the staff used for deliveries, the ones that smelled always faintly of lemon and cleaning oil. I dabbed the edge of the smear from my collar with a napkin that had been folded more times than it should have. My breath slowed. The phone in my hand was a small modern thing, sleek and indifferent. I could have called the police. I could have called anyone. I could have called Orion and demanded an explanation there on the marble steps. I could have done something loud that would make the evening into a story for tomorrow's gossip. Instead, I thought of Cornelius and of how a man who runs trust accounts and trusts the ledger of his life might act when told the truth with proof in hand. He could, quietly and with a lawyer's pen, stop the flow of money that was shaping this spread. He could make the practical moves that would prevent the slow theft of a young woman's inheritance without tearing the family apart in public. He could, perhaps, preserve Clementina's life from being quietly remade while placing the responsibility squarely where it belonged. I looked at my phone. I pictured Booker sitting in his car, watching facts assemble like a careful stitch. I thought about the cost of calling a man like Cornelius and what it might do to my son. Then I thought about the cost of silence for Clementina. The world inside the ballroom hummed like a clock. Somewhere inside, someone clapped a polite hand. My hand smelled faintly of gumbo and of lemon. I put the phone to my ear and felt the weight of everything in that moment, like a thimble between my fingers. I had one move left that night. It would be small. It would be quiet. It would, I hoped, be enough to pull the thread and see how the rest might unravel. I had been taught to hold the fort, to mend what is torn, but sometimes mending means cutting a stitch that will allow the rest to be reworked into something whole. My thumb hovered over the contact. My stomach turned. The night air trembled around me. People continued their toasts, unaware that something had been set in motion, like a hand that starts the sewing machine and keeps watching the needle. I pressed the name and listened to the first ring. And then I pressed the name and listened to the first ring. If you've ever been humiliated by family, drop your city in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from. A slow man answered, voice like a ledger being opened. Zenobia? Cornelius Estrada. His name comes with a kind of punctuation. You know when you say it that the sentence will end in a certain way. Careful, exact, decisive. I kept my voice steady. I told him who I was and where I was sitting. Steps behind the delivery door of the St. Regis, smelling like lemon oil and cold stone. I told him, plain and quick, that I had proof, and that it was in the hands of a private investigator named Booker Hughes, who could authenticate it. There was a small silence. He asked me to send a photograph to his phone. I fumbled in my purse with the lining still smelling faintly of gumbo and perfume, and sent one of the photos Booker had given me, the one folded and penciled over, 2 silhouettes, the light wrong, and the 3 words written across the back of the print. She'll take it all. Booker is on his way, I said. Please, listen to him. It's about funds. There are transfers. There's a recording. Cornelius's breath made a soft sound against the other end of the line, like a man consulting his watch. He told me to stay where I was, to keep my phone on, and that he would not bring spectacle. No theatrics, he said. No lawyers at the door unless they must be. He told me he would come personally and ask that I give him 10 minutes. There is a peculiar kind of mercy in the way the world will sometimes bow its shoulders to a good plan. While I waited, I sat on the steps and watched my hand tighten around the phone until my knuckles rose like knots in rope. The smell of gumbo was still on me, but there was a different smell then, the metal tang of possibility. Booker arrived first, stepping out of his car with the slow, careful gait of a man who has learned discretion as part of his trade. He handed me a small brown envelope of documents he'd verified in the last hour, hotel receipts with timestamps,
a ledger of bank transfers, a list of dates matched to hotel bookings. He had copies of the audio, too, quiet and clipped like a bad telephone line. He had played them for me before, but the way he carried them now, neat as if they were sewing patterns, made them feel like instruments rather than accusations. Cornelius came last, quietly, a man who filled the air more by the absence of fuss than by the weight of his step. He had a scarf tucked into his coat and a calm in the set of his shoulders that suggested a man trained to control a room with a look. He did not walk toward the ballroom as a storm, but as a surgeon does when the patient is near the table. We spoke in the shadow of the rear doors. Booker laid the facts out. Cornelius listened as if he were turning the pages of a book, eyes steady, mouth almost never moving. When Booker finished, Cornelius did what a man like him does. He made 3 calls. The first went quietly to his attorney, a woman with a voice that could make a judge listen. The attorney arranged an immediate emergency review of trust accounts and contact with the bank managers who handled them. Cornelius told her to prepare paperwork to freeze any outgoing transfers tied to the shell companies Booker had uncovered. The second call was to a personal assistant who had ears in the St. Regis. Cornelius asked them to discreetly inform the bride's side that a sensitive matter required a delay in private. The third call was for the police, made not as an accusation, but as a request to preserve records and begin a preliminary inquiry.
What I learned in those 10 minutes is that some power moves are quieter than a slap. They sound like a pen sliding across paper, like an office door closing. They do not require raised voices. They require instead good paperwork and a willingness to use it. Back inside the ballroom, Serafina was still smiling with that practiced composure. From my place in the doorway, I could see her fingers, precise, manicured, touching the edge of a napkin. Her smile was a map of certainty. Reginald sat with a drink that had no name, watching the room fold around his wife. Orion stood at the edge of the head table like someone who had been asked to hold a light while adults spoke. That evening's light stayed the same. No one knew yet that an unseen hand had begun to untie their arrangement. Cornelius's attorney arrived within the hour and asked for a private word with Clementina. She was startled, as anyone would be when a stranger asks to speak. Cornelius himself did not approach the table and shout. He made his representative, a quiet, well-bred man, explain that there were documents that needed review, and that for reasons of fiduciary duty, something had to be paused. The representative spoke with a voice that was both gentle and unarguable. Until we can review certain records, we must advise delay. It is remarkable how quickly the mood of a room can change when a law firm speaks in the right tone. The band's music fizzled into polite confusion. The photographer, who had been leaning in to get a close shot of the head table, put his camera down and folded his arms as if to say, "We are witnesses." Serafina's smile slightly wavered, not because she was guilty, but because her script had a missing page. I watched the faces as the whisper moved like a ripple across the satin and silver. Clementina's face went white and then pink, like a child who has been asked a question too big for her to hold. She excused herself and was taken to a quiet parlor by an attendant, while Cornelius's attorney explained, delicately and in terms she could understand, what the evidence suggested. Transfers, bookings, language in a recording that hinted at an arrangement to control the young woman's inheritance. Clementina's world felt as if it had been tilted. She asked questions I could not answer on my own. Questions about her grandmother's intent, about what the trust meant, about whether she had been loved for herself. Cornelius's voice, when he spoke to her, was the voice of a grandfather who wanted to protect something before it was irreversibly altered. He told her that nothing would move without her consent, and that he would ensure no money would be transferred until every account was accounted for. He looked toward me then, and his expression softened in a way that was not patronizing, grateful instead, like someone who has been shown a door that could have been left closed.
Outside the bubble of the private conversation, Serafina moved like a ship that had struck a reef, confused, then angry, then calculating. She tried to steer the narrative, to produce witnesses, to suggest there was a misunderstanding. She offered to produce receipts of legitimate consulting fees, to show that she had been paying for counseling and not for anything nefarious. Serafina, in public, could turn generosity into a blind. But Booker's files were neat. The bank transfers were more than consulting fees. They increased at times that matched hotel bookings. The recording contained a tone and a cadence that suggested something more than casual conversation, an organizational voice mapping out when certain people would be away and how opportunity could be taken. When Cornelius's attorney presented the documents to the bank complied. Accounts were flagged, transfers paused, and the shell companies were placed under audit. It wasn't dramatic in the way the movies show, no shouting, no chandeliers crashing down. It was paperwork. It was, in the end, the sort of thing that eats an edifice from inside. Banks are careful by nature. Once a man with a trust ledger and an attorney shows up with records, they do what banks do. They buy quiet and certainty. Serafina's countenance shifted as if someone had taken the shine off the pearls she wore. She became smaller in the rooms of her design. She tried then to appeal to family, to produce sentiment. Reginald looked lost, the drink in his glass like ballast against the waves he could not chart. The story spilled, of course, not in the way of gossip that hits the next day's front pages in a flash, but in the slow, efficient way that papers get copies of records when the bank freezes an account, and a well-placed attorney lets the right reporter know there is a case. A journalist from a local paper phoned the venue within 48 hours asking for comment. A blogger, more hungry for hotness than for nuance, circulated a photograph of the wedding, my dress with its faint stroke of gumbo, my pearl necklace catching the chandelier. The internet, when it wants a story, stitches it with its own thread. It took weeks for the legal wheels to grind, and for Serafina to be formally arrested on charges related to financial misconduct, charges brought after a proper review, and with Booker's documentation and Cornelius's counsel providing testimony about the transfers and intent. I will not paint the specifics of the indictment with more color than I should. The courts have their language and their pace. What I can say is that the law, when fed with proof, moved. Serafina was taken into custody after a formal complaint, tried, and once the jury saw the ledger of transfers and heard the authenticated audio clips, she was convicted of fraud and sentenced. The sentence was the predictable ending of such a process. Justice, slow and precise, and the kind that cannot be purchased once the ledger is out.
Reginald's house eventually went into foreclosure. He had been an easy man to pity. The way his shoulders slumped told more of a complicated life than the newspapers could. When his money went, so did the house with its high ceilings and quiet rooms. He found himself in smaller places, where the drink was not a solution, but merely a presence. Orion was perhaps the hardest of this for me to process. When everything fell apart, he did not fall with the grace of someone who has learned from their mistakes. He collided with the consequences like a man who had not expected such firmness. His employers were private about it at first, and then not. His name, once rising like steam in a career office, cooled like cloth set down. He lost his position, his apartment, the neat life he had been building. He moved back into a smaller room near my shop for a time, awkward, proud, chastened. He did not ask for money right away. He asked for places to put his shoes, to hang his jacket. He mailed letters of apology that read like the soft, uncertain stitching of someone who was trying to learn a new pattern. I will confess something here that is as true as any stitch I have made. There were nights when my chest ached with the temptation to take my boy up into my lap and pretend the world had not required any payment from him. Old habits of mothering are thick in us. They bind like thread around bone.
Cornelius was steady. He took the lead in restoring the trust's governance in ways that protected her interests. He spoke with lawyers and therapists and made sure she had privacy and counsel. He came by my shop one slow morning with a box of pastries and an apology for the way the world had arranged itself. He sat at my counter and talked about how easily people make plans for others when they think themselves wise. Clementina came by the shop on her own accord a few times. The first time, she stood in the doorway holding a small bouquet of discolored daisies, the way people hold fragments they are learning to place. She was careful of her smile. She told me she had seen the way Serafina had moved through rooms and how she had learned certain politenesses as armor. She was not a child who had been naive. She had been young and trusting in rooms where people expected trust. She said quietly, "I didn't see it clearly until it was almost over. I am so sorry you were made to look small." I told her she had nothing to apologize for. She sat with me and we mended a seam on a sleeve she had brought as practice. Her hands were quick and careful. Sewing is a kind of therapy. Stitch, press, admire what the thread can do. She stayed for tea and listened as I told her that dignity is something you don't always get to keep without choosing it every day. She thanked me. She cried quietly once, and I handed her my stoneware mug as if to offer warmth. She took it like a child taking a hand. Over months, we built something like a friendship, tender and slow. She began working with Cornelius on charity events and learned to handle checks and ledgers the way a seamstress learns fabric, by touch and time. There were things she would not and could not forget, but she learned that people could be steady and that the world could reweave itself into something that held both beauty and hard lessons. Serafina's trial was public enough that the papers printed photographs and the television put legal experts in suits to talk about fraud. Booker testified. He told the story in the dry, organized voice of a man who had done his job and then moved on. The audio clips were played in court, muffled but enough to show intent. The bank statements were read aloud. The jury watched. I sat in the gallery and let the singer in my head keep its steady thrum. When the sentence came, it came with neither joy nor malice on my part. Justice had a profession to fulfill. It had ordered itself with the modesty of law. The sentence meant Serafina would be held to account. It meant she would not be the one who walked back into drawing rooms with the same certainty she had carried before. It did not undo the night she had plotted or the days of quiet manipulation, but it put a legal point where the ledger had been opened. Orion's path after that was crooked and slow.
He took work where he could find it, menial jobs at first, then a position in a small firm where he was supervised by someone who made early mistakes part of a larger plan for rehabilitation. He did not forgive himself easily. He wrote letters, long ones, in which he described the nights he had thought he was being clever, the times he had ignored that soft voice that used to tell him to be honest. He did not ask me to forget. He asked me to watch as he tried to make himself better. I watched, but I also kept my steady rule. There were moments when he would sit at my kitchen table and we would share a bowl of my own gumbo, the kind that warms a house properly, and he would tell me that he had started going to counseling. He spoke of regret in a way that sounded like the slow, proper sewing of a seam that must be held steady. Sometimes late at night, I would hear him crying softly in the other room, and the sound would cut through me like a small knife. I would put my hand on him, not to fix his pain, but to be present in it. Presence, sometimes, is the only gift a mother can give without unraveling the lessons a child must learn. As for Serafina, prison did its work in the way such places do. They shrink the stage upon which a person was once a star. Her presence in the city circles dwindled. Her pearls, once flaunted like currency, sat untouched in a drawer. When she was released years later, there was a sort of private ruin to her movements. People who had once courted her for status no longer called. The house eventually sold. Reginald, with time, moved to a quiet town where people didn't know the shape of his past. The town around my shop changed too. People who had watched me for years came by and told me they had seen what happened and that they were sorry for the way the evening had gone. They brought bags of fabric, sometimes pies, and told me stories of their marriages, of the ways their own mothers had shown them how to stand. Cornelius, ever the gentleman, came by regularly, not as a savior, but as a neighbor who had learned the seams of my life. He brought me a small, impossible cake once, and told me that he'd set up a fund to help Clementina, one handled transparently, with oversight. He said it in a way that made it clear he felt he owed me a kind of gratitude for bringing facts to light. The stoneware mug became mine again in a new way. I kept it on the counter, chipped rim and all. It carried stains of coffee and gumbo like the rings a life leaves on a table. Visitors would eye it, curious at first, and then fond. I felt confident again at the singer. I sewed with a different tenderness than before, not softer, but more knowing. Clementina eventually came to an event at the shop, a quiet tea where women brought old dresses that needed mending and sat to chat. She was steadier now. She spoke in a voice that had taken on both a new caution and an older kindness.
I remember the way she smiled as if a stitch had been made neat, neither triumph nor pity, but recognition. She hugged me publicly at the end of the event, and with a kind of humility that surprised me, said, "You protected me." Her gratitude landed like warm bread. I never wanted the story to be about praise. What I did was very ordinary. I had evidence. I called someone who could do something with it. But I learned that when ordinary people stitch courage together with courtesy and careful planning, the results can look like miracles to others. Time teaches you how to dress a wound so it will scar well. There were awkward moments later when people would ask if I had been happy to see Serafina punished. I would say no. Punishment is not the same as healing. Accountability was necessary. Justice was necessary. But happiness? Not exactly. There's a difference between wanting the world to be small for someone and wanting them to learn how to be better. I wanted the latter. Orion and I rebuilt a new form of relationship, one with parameters that both held affection and demanded responsibility. He sometimes came by the shop and sat by the singer, watching my hands move. Once he slipped a small envelope across the counter to me. Inside was a single typed page, a list of things he had returned to right, checks to people he had wronged, apologies to ones he had hurt, a promise to begin giving back. He had taken a job in a place that taught young men forms and manners for employment. He had started attending a group where men read about honesty and practice it. It was not enough to wash out the past, but it was a stitch being made. My pride in him was complicated and honest. I could be proud without excusing. I could love without blinding myself to what learning meant. People ask sometimes how I could walk out of the ballroom with gumbo staining my dress and not make some great scene. The answer is simple and sewn into everything I do. Dignity is not the absence of pain. It is the choice to hold the pain without letting it define your next move. When Serafina hurled that bowl, she wanted performance. She wanted me to be small on the stage to entertain the room. Instead, I left the stage and made a phone call. That one quiet call, the one to Cornelius, did not feel heroic. It felt like a well-placed stitch, small, precise, and sure. It set in motion professionals whose job it is to translate truth into action. It began a chain that preserved a girl's inheritance, exposed a slow theft, and let the laws do what laws are meant to do. It cost my son a career. It saved him a life that might have been predicated on a lie. Those are hard balances to keep, but a mother's mercy is not measured by how many times she breaks a child's fall. Sometimes mercy is measured by how honestly she asks a child to stand back up and learn. There were times I doubted the choice.
Nights when I would go to bed and hear that sentence, "She's right, Mama," like a pebble in my shoe. It hurt. Mothers keep an ache of remorse, because even when the choice is right, the cost is human. But then mornings would come, and the singer would hum, and my hands would move, and I would stitch courage into a collar, or mend a hem. Life, like fabric, always needs a seam, or it will fray. Years later, at a small gallery opening in the city, Clementina asked me to stand beside her. She had arranged an exhibit to teach young people how financial literacy can protect them from manipulation, how to question, and how to ask for the documents that define contracts. She spoke publicly about truth and protection and thanked me in a way that was not theatrical, but true. I sat in the audience and watched her, no longer a girl, but a woman who had learned to take the measuring tape of another's counsel and make it her own. Orion stopped by the shop that afternoon. He stood near the window and watched the singer work. He did not ask to be forgiven. He did not demand absolution. He asked instead for work. He asked if there were any small mending tasks he might take on while he found his way back. I looked at him and saw the boy who once made airplanes out of comic strips, and the man who had been broken and was trying to be mended. I put a small stack of collars on the table and handed him the iron. "Start here," I said, "and keep your hands steady." When he had finished the first dozen collars, he looked proud, not in the brash way of the man who walks into a room to be noticed, but in the quiet, honest way of someone who has earned the right to space in the world. He had work to do still. We both did. But the singer kept its steady rhythm, and that was a good thing. The headlines faded. The legal papers closed. The town had other stories to gossip about, but my shop stayed. People came with dresses to be altered, with curtains that needed hems, with a life that required mending. I would listen and sew, and from time to time give advice the way mothers do, plain, practical, and sometimes hard. There is a small satisfaction in telling you all this right now, the shape of consequence, and the way a quiet move reverberates. The woman who threw the bowl of gumbo at me had power, but power can be restrained when facts are placed in the right people. The one quiet call, made from a stoop behind a delivery door, did not humiliate Serafina as revenge. It exposed a pattern and let the law respond. It preserved, in the long run, the dignity of a young woman who deserved to know the truth about her life and inheritance. It taught my son that there are moments when the world demands uprightness more than it desires comfort. If you're listening and thinking about a moment when someone tried to make you small,
I want you to know this. You do not have to make a spectacle to be heard.
Sometimes the quiet work of gathering proof and calling the right person is the most powerful thing you can do. Dignity is not wrapped in loudness. It's stitched quietly into the hem of how you move when everyone is watching. There are still mornings when I take my stoneware mug and set it by the singer and think about that night. I have washed my pearls. I keep the navy dress in the wardrobe for moderate days when I need to remember that clothes are not armor, they are a habit. I have learned to let grief have its seasons and to let boundaries be the arithmetic of love. I have learned that standing up sometimes means standing aside so the proper hands can do what they must. If this story moved you, subscribe for more true life stories and hear how ordinary people stitch courage into their everyday. And if you have a story of dignity regained or a moment when quiet did more than a shout could, share it in the comments or send it my way. I read them. I keep a stoneware mug by the singer and a list of names of people who needed someone to witness them. The world is full of small, brave acts. This was one of mine. Thank you for sitting with me.